What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to replace the lower control arms on your 5th gen 4Runner. Alright, so replacing the lower control arms on the 5th gen 4Runner isn't too difficult to do. It's actually quite an easy procedure with not a lot of steps. Now there's a couple issues you might run into in the process, but we're going to cover that in this video to hopefully make the job easy for you. There's a couple reasons why you might want to replace the lower control arms on your 5th gen 4Runner. Perhaps the ball joint is worn. So if your ball joint is worn, you'll hear a clunking sound over bumps. Accelerating and braking, you may hear a clunking sound or a creaking sound while turning your steering wheel back and forth. Another reason why you might want to replace the lower control arms is perhaps your bushings are worn. For me, that's what's wrong with my lower control arms. I noticed this in Utah. We did one of the trails there. We're coming down, we heard a clunking sound, and we were able to replicate it in town with braking and accelerating. And when looking at the lower control arm while braking and accelerating, just in the parking lot moving back and forth, we could see that lower control arm moving back and forth. Now the bushings in there are made out of rubber, so there is going to be a little bit of play, but I had excessive play. I was able to confirm this when I got home. My wife actually turned the steering wheel back and forth while I looked under, and I could see it moving a bit, and it opened up a little bit, and I shined a flashlight in there and I could see the rubber was starting to tear. And also another way that I was able to confirm that these lower control arm bushings were gone is in a couple recordings, I was able to see my driver's side tire was kind of moving on its own. It had a lot of play over bumps. I'll show you that clip now in slow motion. And also I put a camera under there, GoPro, and I was able to actually record movement in that joint as well. So it was definitely time to replace these lower control arms. You have a couple options. One of them is to push out those bushings, but nobody really does that anymore. You used to be able to do that with older lower control arms. Toyota doesn't recommend doing that anymore. They won't even do it at the dealership. And all the reports online of people that have actually pressed them out just had issues in the future, and it was a very difficult process. Unfortunately, these lower control arms are pretty expensive. My suggestion, if you are picking them up, is don't go to your local Toyota dealer, but use a factory Toyota genuine parts distributor. That's what I did, and I managed to save quite a bit of money by going that route. So let's jump into the video. Let's go over what we'll need to do the job. I'm also going to use the Toyota factory service manual to have all the correct torque specs and the correct procedure there, and I will put that stuff up on the screen for you guys to follow along with. But yeah, let's jump into what we'll need to do the job. All right, let's start off by talking about the supplies that you need to do the job. Obviously, you will need the lower control arms. I also picked up my toe adjustment cam here. The reason why I picked this up is because these quite often will seize inside the lower control arm bushing here. It is a piece of metal that slides into a metal sleeve. The tolerances are quite tight, and Toyota doesn't put anything on these, so they actually usually seize and rust in there. It makes it difficult for your tech to make alignment adjustments, and it also makes it almost impossible to remove these lower control arms. I picked up anti-seize so that when I put this back in here, or when I put this in here, it will not seize in the future, and I will be able to get these off, and my alignment tech can easily make adjustments. So it's a good thing to have just 2 of these so you don't get stuck in the middle of the job, you know, having to cut these off and then go to the dealership to get replacements. Just have them. It's a good thing to have. You'll also need a paint marker just so you can mark all of your alignment specs or the current alignment that you have, so you can make a rough kind of alignment to get you to your alignment tech. We also have brake clean just to clean off all these parts to make these marks, and some WD-40 or a penetrating oil. There's a few of these bolts that will kind of get stuck on there, especially this ball joint nut. It will get stuck on there. It just rusts up a lot, so a good thing to have the penetrating oil just to help you with that. So here's the tools that you need to do the job. So you're going to want a breaker bar, a 19mm socket, a 22mm socket, a 24mm long socket. You're going to want something to pry with, so a long flathead like this works. You're going to want a hammer just to punch stuff out. Obviously a wrench, a 1/2 inch with an extension. We have a 19mm wrench, a 22mm wrench, and a crescent wrench. Now, the 22mm wrench, if you don't have this, you can get away with just using the crescent wrench, but we will need the crescent wrench anyways to make adjustments to the cams. You will need a torque wrench and some pliers. All right, let's just quickly talk about some tools that hopefully you don't need, but that you should probably have on hand just in case. So you're gonna wanna have a Sawzall on hand with a metal cutting blade, just in case that cam adjuster gets seized in there, the one we were just talking about. You may need to cut through it, so a metal cutting blade and a Sawzall. You may want some gas to heat up your lower ball joint nut. That nut loves to just rust right on there and seize on there, so this will help you get it off. We also have a drill, just in case that cotter pin on that lower control arm ball joint is just completely rusted in there. You may actually have to drill it out. We'll try using a punch and some other things, but if we can't, we may just need to drill it. Also, it's good to have the drill with a wire brush to clean up that cam adjuster. So if you can actually slide out your factory one, you might want to clean up that rust and coat it with anti-seize. So this comes in handy for that as well. So this is just some stuff you might want to have on hand to make the job a little easier in case you run into some issues. All right, with your vehicle on the ground, start breaking loose all of those lug nuts on your tire. Once the lug nuts are all loose, you can chock your tires and start jacking up your 4Runner. Once your 4Runner is up in the air, place those jack stands under the frame and lower it down. You can now finish removing that front tire. Take the front tire and place it under the cross member just as a safety precaution. You're now ready to take off the skid plate. This will be a 14 or 12 millimeter bolt depending on which skid plate you have. I'll put something up on the screen here for your skid plate removal, just in case you don't have that information or if you have a different skid plate. If you have KDSS, here is the procedure you'll need to follow. All right, so we'll put a jack stand under the lower control arm just to support it, and we're going to remove the bolt on the bottom of the shock. This is a 19 millimeter wrench and socket. Remove the nut and the washer and pop that bolt out. I just use an extension with the hammer. We are now ready to remove the lower sub-assembly from the lower ball joint. So there'll be 2 bolts here. Use a breaker bar. I believe these are 19 millimeters as well. Once those are out, you can clean off all of your cams. You'll want to clean off 4 of them. I have an undercoating here, so mine are pretty dirty. So I'm using brake clean and just wiping it with a cloth. Once all 4 are clean, you can now put markings on. I did them near the cam tab, gusset, and also one on the indicator. Just in case I needed to cut this, I wanted to have one on the indicator just to replicate. So I did this on the front and back. Like I said, there are 4 in total. We're now ready to start breaking these bolts loose. So use a breaker bar and a 22 mil socket and break this free. So the front is a bolt and on the back you'll go for the nut. There'll be a number of components, just take them off. If you need to cut this, this is where you'll take your Sawzall and cutting blade, you'll cut here and here. We're going to try to get mine out, so we'll see how that goes. I was just prying with a flathead screwdriver, but you can use a crescent wrench and kind of move it back and forth while prying. Fortunately, I was able to just pry it with the flathead and then actually use my hands to remove it, which is pretty uncommon, I think. So I was pretty lucky there, but you can see the rust on the bolt. So this actually rusts in there in a lot of cases, and it prevents you from being able to get it out. So here we are taking that nut off of the back part of the lower control arm. That's a 22 mil. And we'll just pop that bolt out. Now what you want to do is lay out all of your hardware in the same order you took it off, and you know which order it all goes back together. We're now ready to take off the lower control arm. I was unfortunately able to get the cotter pin out. I tried punching it out with a punch. That did not work. I tried using pliers. That did not work, so I ended up just drilling it out. We're now ready to move that subassembly from the lower ball joint. Mine is quite rusted. I had to use a penetrating oil and a lot of heat, and that 24 millimeter long or deep socket. If you don't have a vise like this, you could put it back on the vehicle and crank it off. And then we'll just knock it out with a hammer. So I was able to reuse these cams. So what I did is I cleaned them up with a wire brush, and then I just put a little anti-seize on them. I also put it on the bolts where the threads are. You don't want to get anti-seize on the rubber bushings though, so avoid that, but the way that I did it, it won't come in contact with those rubber bushings. It'll just be on the bolts and inside those cam sleeves. All right, so you can start assembling the hardware the way that you removed it. Now we're going to do the final torquing with the vehicle on the ground. So we're just kind of tightening it up just enough to keep these cams in place. So use your crescent wrench and kind of line up the cams and then tighten up the bolts and nuts. You want to just tighten them up enough that you can kind of keep that alignment spec in place. You don't want to tighten them right up because we want to have movement. So here I am putting the lower subassembly onto that lower ball joint. Just getting everything lined up, then we're going to feed those 2 bolts in. We're not going to torque them down yet. We're actually going to torque down the lower control arm ball joint first. So we're going to torque that down to 103 foot-pounds of torque. So that's on our lower ball joint. Once we have it torqued down, we'll put that cotter pin in and bend it down. We're now ready to tighten up those 2 bolts that go into the steering knuckle. we'll torque these down to 118 foot-pounds of torque. All right, so we're now ready to start putting that lower shock bolt back in and the washer and nut. Now we're going to temporarily install these, and that means just tighten them up loosely because we're going to torque them on the ground. If you have KDSS, follow this procedure. You're now ready to start putting the wheel back on. All right, stabilize suspension. So lower your suspension down now and torque on your wheel. You're now going to want to make sure that all those cams are lined up. So just double check, and then we're going to torque down this bolt on the lower control arm to 129 foot-pounds of torque. So you'll have 4 cams in total. So make sure all 4 cams on the front and back are lined up. And we'll torque that back nut to 129 foot-pounds of torque. And now with the vehicle still on the ground, we're going to torque that shock bolt up to 70 foot-pounds of torque. You can now put your skid plate on and take your vehicle in for an alignment. You are now finished the job. All right, guys, I hope you found that video useful. Replacing the lower control arms is not that difficult. There isn't too many steps to it. It's actually quite easy to do. There's just a couple things you might run into, a couple issues, but I hope this video gave you guys the confidence and all the information that you need to do the job and to work around those issues if you do encounter them. If you guys found this video useful, please like and subscribe. I hope to come up with a lot more videos, and I always appreciate your guys' support. I hope to see you guys in the next video. Bye now.